So today is lesson 9. It's Wednesday. And I've received not all, but I've received a lot of assignment 2 submissions. I've marked all of those, including the ones that were late. So everybody has marks for that. We're going to use those submissions in lab 2. I'm going to give that lab out at the end of class. Okay, so for this week, you're going to have both a small lab and quiz to do. You'll have a week to do them. Okay, so we'll look at both of those at the end of class. For starters, we're going to do a couple of things. We think we completed the securing of our Node app using Passport Local, but today we're going to implement also a third-party sign-in. And I think we're going to do sign-in with GitHub for fun. So we're going to implement that into our project. We're also going to look at related data. Right now, our data model is incredibly simple. Really, pretty much the only thing we have we're saving to the database is artist names. So we want to be able to create albums and attach those albums to artists. So there's a few different ways of doing this when we're working with a NoSQL database. It's not quite as structured or as regimented as it would be with a relational database. So we're going to look at how we can relate that data and add albums and attach those to artists. And then we will go over the lab and quiz at the end of class. So to get started today, first thing we want to do is let's open up our project and get it running. Actually, we'll open up the project. I actually did a little sample of everything we're going to accomplish today. So maybe what I'll do, I'll actually just show you my sort of a completed version of what we're going to do today to give you a picture of where we're going. I have a little test project. It's a copy of our Node tunes. We're going to do things a little bit differently, but fairly similar. So I'll just run this one first. You can open up your Node tunes project. So I'll kind of give you a little preview. So one thing we're going to want to do is allow users to log in with the GitHub credential. I'm already signed in, so it shows my GitHub username here. Now we might format this a little bit differently. But if I go in and edit an artist here, I can see albums, or I could go and add an album for this artist. So I've added the album, and now I can see both of the albums, both of the child data, when I'm looking at the artist details. So this is the type of functionality we want to add today. Although we may break it out, set it up a little differently. Okay, but this is where we are going. Okay, there's an update to NodeMon. Do I want to update my NodeMon? Yeah, maybe I do. No big deal, but I'll update it. I'll install it globally, so I'll get the latest version of NodeMon. Not critical. And now I will open up the Node Tunes project. And I'll use NodeMon to launch our application. It says I'm connected. So here we are. Right, as an anonymous user, I see all the artists. If I log in as user, so again, I'll put in the chat the credential we set up last week, user@gc.ca, I think with test1234 was our password. So now my register and login links, they get hidden. We see my username and log out, and now I got the ability to edit or delete or add. So we want to start to implement third-party sign-in, we're going to allow people to sign in using a GitHub account. So there's a number of steps we're going to need to go through. I'm going to go to the main Passport site. And we can look. We're going to use this. There's actually two versions of Passport with GitHub. Because the original developer, the original one is much older, hasn't been maintained for a long time. So the Passport GitHub 2 package, it's a little more up to date. So they've taken the fork of the original open source project and developed a new one. So how is this going to work? Let's kind of take a look at what we're going to need to do. We're going to need to install Passport-GitHub 2. We're going to need to then, in our app.js, configure Passport to use a new GitHub strategy. And there are 3 values we need to supply. A client ID and client secret, so a set of API keys we're going to create on GitHub, and then a callback URL. So where does GitHub return the user after successful login? And then we've got some code here to try and identify the user after successful GitHub sign-in. So most of the code is actually here. I'm going to put the link in the chat. I would recommend opening up this browser tab. We're going to do most of what's here. We may modify it a little bit. The other thing we need to do before we can use GitHub login is we need to go to the actual GitHub website, and we need to create a new application to generate these GitHub client ID and GitHub client secret values. So I'm going to put another link in the chat, show you how to get there. I put the link in the chat, but the other way to get there is just go to GitHub. And then if you click on your account settings, it takes you to github.com/settings/profile. And way down in this long navigation, there's applications. So if we click on applications, we're going to go to the authorized GitHub apps. Sorry, let's try this one, I think. Authorized OAuth apps. Let's see, there should be a button here to create a new application. Bear with me for a second. Here, sorry. So we go to settings, under developer settings. And then OAuth apps here. So now we can create a new, or the link's in the chat, we just go to application/new. So we're going to give it a name. I'll call it Node Tunes. The homepage URL. For now, I'm just going to use my local URL. If I was going to publish this to Heroku, I would be putting in my live. So for your assignment, you'll create an application, and you'll need your live Heroku URL. And then we need a callback URL. So for the callback URL, let's use localhost 3000/GitHub/callback. So the home page is just localhost 3000. callback URL, localhost 3000/github/callback. And then we can register the application. Once we do this, GitHub will create a client ID and client secret that we can include in our node project. So I'll click register. My client ID is here. We will generate a client secret as well in a couple minutes. Okay, so we've created the app. Then we can go back to our code editor. And the next step in our code editor is to install Passport GitHub 2. So I'm just going to stop my server for a moment with Control-C. And let's run npm I passport-github 2. There's no spaces here. There's just a dash between the words passport and GitHub. It's not case sensitive. So we're going to install the Passport authentication package for GitHub Auth. npm I passport-github 2. So I'll hit enter. And the package has been installed. Our next step is to set up the GitHub configuration in our project. Got lots of files open. I think I'll just close everything up for now. So I'm going to go into my config folder, into the globals file, and I'm going to add a GitHub section. So in camel case, and we're going to have 3 values in here. Client ID, and GitHub refers to it. The package uses a capital I and a capital D, so be careful. It's not camel case. We'll just set that as an empty string. We've got to set the client secret. And we also have to set the callback URL. And again, URL, those are all caps. So it's not, you can't write this in full camel case. And in this case, our URL will be localhost 3000 GitHub callback. If I was going to push this up to Heroku, again, I would be using my live herokuapp.com domain instead. I'm just going to work locally for today. So add this section to your globals file, and then we're going to copy and paste first the client ID from the GitHub developer portal into our first empty string, and then we're going to generate a client secret, and we will copy and paste that one in too. So I will return to this file in a minute. I'm going to go back to GitHub, copy my client ID, and I'll paste it in as the first value here, the client ID value inside my GitHub section. I then need to go back to GitHub. I'm going to click Generate a New Client Secret. And now I can copy this. I don't know that you can see the secrets after the first time you create them. I don't think so. So I've copied that, pasted it in. So the client secret value is going to be quite a bit longer, about double the length of the client ID. So the client ID is visible right away. The secret you actually have to generate, copy and paste it in. And then just like we're reading the database connection string from our globals file, we'll be able to read our client ID, client secret, and callback URL when we're configuring Passport for GitHub Authentication. And most of that work is going to happen in our app.js. Pardon me. So that's the file we want to open next. So let's open app.js. Now there's one line of code in here that we already need to move where it is. So in our app.js, near the top, we configured Passport last week. So starting around line 9 down to line 31, we put all this stuff in here. And then later on, we had our controller declarations. Take out some of this extra spacing. And then our database connection was down here. That's fine. The issue is going to be our database connection. We're linking in our globals file here, way down below. We're going to need this globals file now before we can use Passport GitHub, because we've got to read the client ID, client secret, and callback from the config. So this constant declaration of globals, I'm going to cut this and I need to move it up near the top of the file because we need this before we can configure the Passport GitHub app. So I'm going to cut out that line, the reference to globals. I'm actually going to move it all the way up here. So by moving this reference to the top, we will have it enabled in time for both Passport and our database. I'm going to add So here we've got our Passport local auth. We'll add our Passport GitHub auth underneath. So first we're configuring Passport locally, which we did last week. It's already up and running. Now we want we'll create a GitHub constant. We're going to link to the Passport GitHub 2 library, but I'm going to add something here. We're creating an instance of the strategy object. So instead of a local strategy, we're going to use the Passport GitHub strategy. Then we'll enable passport.use, new instance of GitHub, And now we need to supply those 3 values that are in our config file: client ID, client secret, and callback URL. So this is going to be our globals.github.clientID. We'll set up the secret same way. So we're linking to the package. We're enabling an instance of the strategy. We're calling passport use, and we're creating a new instance of this object and passing in the 3 parameters that GitHub is going to need to authenticate us. I'm just going to jump back to the passport docs for a minute. So we've done this part, we've configured the strategy, and they've got a callback here. We can try this code. We may have to modify it a little bit, but we can actually try and see what happens here. So we configure the GitHub strategy, and then we've got a callback. When we get a request to GitHub, they'll give us an access token. And if the user is logged in with GitHub, they'll send us back a profile. This done parameter, this is just our callback. And then we can call find or create with this GitHub profile ID. And this will tell us if that user already exists. We'll try this. I've rewritten the code a different way, but we can try it this way and see if it works. Sometimes the documentation's a bit incomplete. But we will try it their way. We'll see what happens. So after my sorry. At the end here so far, we've got 2 round brackets. So we're going to try this in here. We're going to set up access token, refresh token, profile, and then they call their callback done. So we've got 4 parameters here when we send a user off to GitHub. So we're going to call find or, yeah, okay, their method doesn't work. Our library doesn't even have a find or create method. Okay, that's all right. So we're going to do this. This is part of the problem with their documentation. It just assumes oh, you're right. It's right after the curly bracket. Thank you, Adam. I've got it in the wrong place. But we don't have this find or create method in Mongoose. we would need an extension in order for it to work. So it's okay, we tried, we looked at the docs. Okay. Sorry, we'll take that out. Right after the curly brace, we will try it the way that I had planned to do it anyway. We want to make an asynchronous call to GitHub. It will return an access token, a refresh token to keep that GitHub login active, a profile, and then a callback. So we are going to use a try and a catch here. So what are we going to do when the user comes back from GitHub? First thing we're going to do is see, do we already have this user? Are we creating a new user, or are we just logging them in? We will call find one. So we'll take the ID we get back from GitHub. Now we don't have an OAuth ID parameter yet. We're going to need to modify our user model a little bit. We'll do that next. Before we can test this out, if we get a user match, we just return our callback with null, no error, but we send our user back. User already exists. And continue. Yep, person has tried logging in with GitHub. We've already registered their GitHub ID in our database. We know who they are, so they can sign in. Otherwise, we need to create the new GitHub user. So we're going to create a new user object. GitHub will give us their username in the profile that we get. We're going to list that this user comes from GitHub in case we want to enable other providers as well. That way we would know who's a Google user, who's a GitHub user, who's a Facebook user, for example. And we'll set up their OAuth ID so it's tied to their GitHub ID. So we're creating this object, and then we want to save it. So we'll save the new user. And then finally, we'll call back, we'll continue on. So we're going to create the new user and return to the calling function. If we get an error, we'll just return our error. I know that's a fair bit of code. Hard to do in pieces, though, unfortunately. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Now, this isn't set up to work quite yet. We'll need to modify our user model to include two new optional properties, an OAuth provider as a string and an OAuth ID. We're probably best to make that a string as well, because we don't know with different providers, some might use strings as part of those IDs. Like I know Microsoft will give us a string rather than a number. So I'm going to open up my model. I'll put the code up on GitHub in just a second. In the user model, we're going to add two new properties. OAuth provider as a string, and OAuth ID. So these are written in camel case. Both of them will be strings. And they're not required, because when somebody signs in on our own site with a username and password, if they register with our registration form, they're not using GitHub, the OAuth provider and the OAuth ID, those will be null. We won't have those. I'll just put all this up on Git right now, and I will redisplay the app.js in a minute. So it's lesson 9, part 1. Dashboard, Git. So I think hard to show it all. I think other than the last bracket, you can see everything that's here. I'll leave this up on screen. We may have to modify it a little bit, but I think our code should work this way. So we're going to call GitHub. We're going to get back a user profile. We're going to see if that user already exists in the database. And if they are, we're just sending that user back. If we don't have that user, we're going to create a new user with their GitHub username and ID. We're going to hard code the provider as GitHub, and then we're going to save them to the database and return that object. So fairly complex kind of logic here. If I move this up, take out the character term, we can see it all. I'm going to run my app now with NodeMon. We can't use GitHub yet, but I just want to see that it doesn't crash. If it crashes, obviously, we've got some more work to do here. The GitHub login, it won't be active, but at least running my application will tell me whether there's any syntax errors or problems with what we've done so far. Oh, it doesn't connect because I took a password. Okay, so it says I'm connected. And my application is running. So there's no errors. So that's good. But the GitHub login isn't actually here yet. So we want to put it on both the register and login forms to allow someone to log in via GitHub. So let's go. We'll open up. I'm going to open up login and register. So I'm going to add a button here. Say login with GitHub. Actually, whoops, sorry. I'm going to make this a link, not a button. I'll style it as a button. So I'll change that to an anchor tag. And it will just link to /GitHub. So beside the register button, actually, I guess we can say register with GitHub. On the login page, you can say login with GitHub, but they're going to go to the same place. I'm going to copy that and put it beside the login button. I'll now say login or login with GitHub. So now I get on my login screen, I get login with GitHub, register, I get register with GitHub. When we click, it makes a GET request to GitHub, which fails because we don't have a controller method yet. We haven't provided any instruction to our app what happens at this URL. So we need to write two methods in our index controller. We need the get handler for this URL, and then we will also need a get handler for our callback URL. So one that will invoke the GitHub login, and the other that receives the user back from GitHub after they've authenticated. And we can actually, the documentation is pretty good about what we need. The code's pretty much here. Here's the get. So we'll call passport.authenticate GitHub, scope of email. So this is all we're asking for from GitHub is the user's email, basically. And username and ID. So this will invoke the GitHub sign-in. And then our callback function will call passport authenticate GitHub, and it will set up a failure redirect as well as a success redirect. So I'm going to modify these slightly, but this is basically the code we need now to get this, to complete this. So let's go to our controllers. We're going to open up index.js. And first we're going to write a get handler at the URL /GitHub. So router.get /GitHub with our, I'm sorry, we don't need the usual callback in this case. We're just going to call passport.authenticate with the GitHub strategy. And then we pass in scope is user.email. That should be it. Saying it wants a callback. So the name of the strategy are options. Says it wants a callback. I think we can put one in, but I don't think it matters, really. No, I'll leave that out. I think it's going to work even without that third option. Yes, user : email. Nice catch, Adam. Thank you. You are an outstanding syntax debugger. So that's user : email. Thank you. So this should open up the GitHub window when we click. Oh, you're not trying, you're doing. But we'll also need the callback handler because users can never come back from GitHub without it. The GET request for our callback. GitHub callback. Again, we call passport.authenticate with GitHub. So this is where that code we wrote in app.js gets invoked. When it comes back, this is then going to run this code when we get a user profile back from GitHub. It's going to go through this logic whether this GitHub profile already exists in our database, and if it doesn't, it's going to create that user and send them back. So we're going to call passport authenticate with GitHub. We'll set up a failure redirect. So if the GitHub login fails, we just send them back to login. And then lastly, we've got our callback here, our request response. In this case, we just call res.redirect. We're going to take them to the artist page once they sign in. So now we can try this out. I'm going to try it in a private browser. I'm already signed in to my GitHub account here in Firefox. Actually, I guess the easiest thing, I could just sign out, I suppose. And I'll sign out of GitHub. My app's still running, so this is good. So get invokes the GitHub sign-in attempt, the get GitHub, and the get GitHub callback receives that authenticated user after somebody is signed in with GitHub already. So now I can try it out. So I'll go to register. I'll click register with GitHub. It's asking me, do you want to sign into GitHub to continue to the Node Tunes app? It asks me to authorize, right? Am I going to allow this? So it's going to have access to the email address and any email addresses, and it tells me it's going to redirect me back to this domain. I'll click authorize. And now I'm signed in with my GitHub username. Cool. I want to try the login as well. So I'm going to log out. Now I'll try my login with GitHub. And I'm in right away. I only have to authorize that application to my profile once. If I go and have a quick look in my database, just jump over to MongoDB. I want to see what does that user account look like. It's letting me log in. I could open up Compass, but I'll just I can look at the database in my browser as well. I'll click on my database cluster and click on collections. And here's my users collection. So now you can see, here's my first user with my local sign-in. Here's my GitHub user. It's got my GitHub username. It timestamps. Actually, you won't see this in yours. I did this in my sample. Here's my provider is GitHub, and there is the OAuth ID. So that's the ID that I get from GitHub. You won't have the created timestamp in yours. That's fine. So now I can sign up or sign in using my GitHub credential. So we created the application on GitHub through settings, applications, new. We put in the callback URL, we generated our API keys. We stored the keys in our global config file. We modified the user model to include two new properties, the OAuth provider and OAuth ID. We configured Passport GitHub and app.js with our callback URL, client ID, and client secret. And then we make a call to the GitHub login, and we evaluate if we get a user back. Are we logging them in because we already know who they are, or do we have to create an account for them in our site? We enabled GitHub links on register and login. And we've adapted from the documentation the two get handlers for GitHub and the GitHub callback. So now our GitHub authentication is working. One of the options you have in assignment 3 is to enable a different sign-in provider, but the process will be quite similar to what we did with GitHub. I will push everything up. Yours isn't working. Okay, several of you aren't working. User.get isn't a function. That would be in app.js. Which line? Okay, if it won't direct you back, okay, let me first push this code up so you can also check it. Okay, I've pushed everything up. Okay, if GitHub is loading, but it won't redirect you back, a few things to check. Number one, make sure you have the correct callback URL registered in your application. So if you go to back to your application, So make sure that this URL is /github/callback. And make sure you've also got this same URL in your globals file. And in your index controller, your get path is /github/callback. Make sure you've also got the leading space here. So if it's loading GitHub but not coming back, that suggests something may be wrong in one of those callback URLs. Jason and Chris, check that. Adam, I'm thinking about your error. Let's put it back up. You've got a comma here, Adam, in the callback to separate those parameters. Right, so it's async and await here. If you're getting 404, the link is /GitHub. So there needs to be a / in that href on your register link. And same in index.js, that path should be prefixed with a /. So I think what we will do here, I've pushed everything to GitHub. So I'm going to recommend we take a quick pause here. Let's take 10 minutes. I'm going to stop the recording, have a look at what's on GitHub. And if we need to do a bit more debugging when we return after a short break, we can do so. I'm going to stop the recording, have a look at GitHub. If we need to do a bit more debugging, we come back, we will. Okay, Booger, one issue is, again, we had to move the globals file up. It was too far down in the file originally, so I've moved it up near the top. And my globals file is now declared up here, whereas before it was declared after passport. So you need to move it near the top before here.